Tate Paulette is the author of In the Land of Ninkasi, A History of Beer in Ancient Mesopotamia. He is an associate professor in the Department of History at North Carolina State University and studies urban food systems in the ancient world. A native of North Carolina, he holds an MA and PhD in Near Eastern archaeology from the University of Chicago and an MA in archaeology from the University of Edinburgh. Welcome, Tate.
Welcome. Thank you. I'm happy to be here. I will say that your voice is kind of breaking up a little bit still for me, so I don't know if everyone's getting that or not. But
yeah.
Okay. So, anyways, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm sorry. There is some kind of a technical issue that I'm not figuring out. And I will see if I will get any feedback from our audience and see if anybody else is having it.
Okay.
So, Tate, you recently published a book in the Land of Ninkasi, which it's such an interesting story. So I find her Ninkasi interesting alone, let alone the history of Mesopotamia. So we have a lot to explore. But before we start, if you can tell us, what inspired you to focus on the history of beer in ancient Mesopotamia. If you can start that story first.
Okay, sure. Yeah. So how did I get into this topic of beer? I mean, I guess it really kind of happened in a sort of accidental way. I kind of fell into it a little bit. I was when I was in grad school, I was writing a dissertation about grain storage, so about like silos and things like that. So in the period when you have like the first cities and first states in Mesopotamia, I was looking at the archaeological evidence for large scale grain storage. Like, were these states storing up lots of grain and redistributing it to their constituents? So I had been working on that for quite a while. And then at some point, a friend of mine, Mike Fisher, was also a grad student, and I were at a bar, not surprisingly, and we were drinking some beer, and we kind of we had recently, like, we kind of said, well, why are we not studying beer in ancient Mesopotamia? I'm already deeply embedded in grain. One of the main ways that they consumed their grain was beer. So we had sort of started looking into the topic a little bit. And then he heard kind of through the grapevine that there was a brewer from Great Lakes Brewing in Cleveland who wanted to do a collaboration with ISAC, the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures. It used to be called the Oriental Institute then, but that's where we were working on our PhDs. And so we heard that they wanted to do this experimental Mesopotamian brew. And even though we hadn't really spent a lot of time with the topic yet, we sort of enthusiastically volunteered. And so we were kind of thrown into this by trying to recreate their beers. So that's how I got into it. That was maybe about 2011 or so, 2012. Yeah.
Okay, so by the way, I want to mention that I also wrote an article for the Chaldean News about your whole story and how you came across this, and it's going to be actually, I think it was recently released, so I will also attach that so for people can read about it. And beer at that time, I know from reading about it, played a significant role. And I think most people don't understand the significance that it had. It wasn't just, it was actually used for different purposes than what it is today. And if you can share with us, what was the significant role that beer had in with the people of Mesopotamia?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so I will say maybe one thing that I hope comes across in the book is that, yes, it both played different roles than today, but also there's a good bit of overlap. So there's both kind of commonalities and then things that might seem sort of strange. Yeah, I think it was absolutely fundamental to their culture. I mean, beer was everywhere. They talk about it all the time. I mean, probably so if you're reading Sumerian literature, for example, beer is all over the place, and maybe and Akkadian literature also. So for example, probably the most famous place that beer shows up is in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where you have this kind of key scene early on where the wild man in Kidu has been sent to basically confront Gilgamesh, but Before he can go to the city of Uruk and do that, he basically has to be transformed from a wild man living out in the countryside into a civilized human being. And so he's sort of that famously that involves sending this woman Shamhat out to seduce him. But then he also has to be cleaned up, given clothes. But then a really pivotal moment is he has to learn how to eat the food that people of Mesopotamia eat. Not grazing with the gazelles out in the countryside. He has to learn how to eat bread and drink beer, because those were the fundamental, that was food and drink in Mesopotamia. So you have like the Epic of Gilgamesh, this fundamentally important text that was beloved across the region. And early on in this pivotal moment for one of the key characters, you have beer playing a key role. So that's just kind of one indication of how important it was culturally.
And then tell us about Ninkasi. Who was Ninkasi, and what was her role in this whole process?
Yeah, sure. So Ninkasi, in the title of my book, is the goddess of beer in Mesopotamia. And we don't know as much about her as we do about some of the other deities, but she shows up relatively often in literature. And what she typically shows up as is as a brewer. So she's the goddess of beer, but especially associated with brewing. The most famous text about her we call the Hymn to Ninkasi. We don't really know exactly what it was, some kind of song, perhaps. And it's basically a song praising Ninkasi. And the way, in order to praise her, it's basically running through, showing her at work in the brewery, basically maybe brewing up a batch of beer from start to finish. So it gives us these little sort of snapshots of her at work in the brewery. And so this has been, this is particularly well known because they don't really tell us how they brewed beer very often. And so this is really our best evidence for the what might have been the brewing process, is this hymn praising Ninkasi.
And you said that there isn't a lot of evidence, but there was a certain technique that was used that is that you have discovered when finding out how they brewed beer, and also if you can share about the story about the straws.
Okay, yes. All right. Okay, so first, so brewing techniques. I mean, you've looked at the book. This is a huge question. I spend a lot of time digging down into this. I think so. One of the things in my book that I try to be very upfront by telling readers like that we know a lot about this culture. We really do know a lot about this beer culture in ancient Mesopotamia. I call it the world's first great beer culture. But at the same time, there's all kinds of gaps in our knowledge and big unanswered questions. And definitely the realm of brewing techniques, technologies, how they brewed their beer is a huge question, though we do have lots of evidence. So let's see. What was your question? Just what are the how do we know about it? It's a huge one. So
Yeah. And I know, in a lot of senses, you say that there is this evidence, but then there's a lack of evidence. So, but the evidence that there is out there, or
yeah,
what you discovered, or even the ingredients, I guess, that they used.
sure, yeah.
And then I liked like the descriptions about the straws. What was
Yes.
one of the things
Straws,
that
yeah.
were often, yeah.
Okay.
Yes, the straws are very important because again, when we find one thing, then we kind of start realizing, oh, okay, well, it's not just the first recipe of beer, but then there's all these how they drank the beer and why they drank it with straws was very interesting as well.
Yeah. No, it was, okay, I'll start with the more about the brewing. So
Okay.
there's like points of commonality with most of our beers today. With many of them are brewed with malted barley, so that was definitely their key brewing ingredient. They also used other familiar things like emmer wheat, other kind of barley products that were processed in different ways. They also sometimes at least use date syrup in their beers. But then there are some big questions. There's that one of the other key brewing ingredients is called bapir in Sumerian, and there's been a lot of debate about what this is. We don't know exactly, and there have been a lot of interesting proposals. So, for example, another it might be a kind of like bread or cake or something like that, but some people don't agree. One experimental brewing project back in the early 90s They thought it was something like biscotti, so like a twice baked bread, because we know there was an oven that was used in the production of this. And so they made a sort of biscotti like thing that they added early in the brewing process, where it would contribute like fermentable sugars and flavors and things to the beer. Whereas our project, and I think this agrees with a number of other people, think we went with a different interpretation, which is that Bapir might have been more like a fermentation starter, so a dried out fermentation starter that they were using when they were ready to sort of add the yeast and bacteria to start the fermentation. So that's a big question on the ingredient side. Another one is that they didn't use hops, which we use for many of our beers today for flavoring as an aromatic. And the question of what kind of aromatics they might have used is a difficult one. There is one ingredient called kasu that they do use, at least in the later parts of the history I'm telling, but there's been a huge amount of debate about what exactly this, what kind of plant this was. But otherwise, we don't learn much at all about what they were using to flavor the beers. There's all kinds of questions about what kind of equipment they were using. When they talk about brewing equipment, they especially like to talk about two vessels that were a kind of pair. There was a vessel with a hole in the base, and that's set above what they call a receiving vessel, a sort of collecting vessel. There's even one. There's big questions about what role they were playing in the brewing process, because they don't really tell us that. But what they like to say is they love the sound that these vessels made speaking to one another. They even tell us in one piece of literature that they made a double double sound. So if you imagine like double double, double double, double double, like liquid dripping from one down into the other. So you have a sense of maybe a filtering function or something like that. So okay, is that enough about brewing? I'll talk about straws now. Yes.
Yes. Well, that's good about this part, even is good information for us. So yes, now the straws.
Okay, straws. So moving from the kind of production to the consumption, and so I will say that we don't know exactly what their beers would have been like in terms of texture. Sometimes we've assumed that they were pretty thick, but I think the straw evidence suggests that at least some of them probably had some solid matter still floating in them, or something that you would want to filter out when you were drinking them. But I should say that they also had lots of different kinds of beer that kind of vary by period. And so I think if you're sort of thinking, I've heard that their beer was just nasty, it must have been just like a gross kind of sludge. I don't think that that's the case. I mean, they loved these beers. They had, almost certainly by the point of the story I'm telling, they had thousands of years of beer drinking behind them. And so they appreciated sort of the finer points of them. So, and I think we should assume that they had always had a range of different types. In any case, so one of the classic ways that they like to depict beer drinking in the artistic record, and they depict it a lot, is that they show people drinking often from a communal vessel through long straws. And so we have a bunch of, for example, banquet scenes from the early dynastic period, where you often see multiple people next to a vessel with drinking through straws. There's also, I start out the book by narrating this. There's another classic kind of scene using a straw, which shows a man and a woman having sex. The woman is bending over, drinking through a straw from a vessel. And so I also go into some detail. We don't just have artistic representations of these straws, which almost certainly would have been mostly made out of, just reeds. Sometimes we have fancy ones made out of metal, but we also have little metal filter tips that would have been attached to the end of the reed straw and then sort of submerged down in the beer. And they had little holes poked in them to help filter out that solid matter as you're drinking the beer through the straw. And so we have quite a few of those, and they even sometimes have remains of the reed preserved on the inside of them.
So Tate, when you're describing all these images, I mean, I'm feeling like I'm seeing a scene in the Western world. Yes.
Yeah, sure. I mean, they
Yeah,
had.
really. I mean, this is, when you're describing this, I can see you're talking like thousands of years ago and how they used it, and even one with depicting, them having sex, and there's beer there, and it sounds like something you see in movies, or it's the American European life. So this is so interesting. This is, I think, what's interesting about this book also. yes, it is about Ninkasi and the history of beer, but you find other things related to that area. And I'm sure in your case, when you were writing about this, the initial interest was about the history of beer. But what are the interesting things that you discovered about that area in addition to?
Okay, yeah. So, I should say, like, I was already studying Mesopotamia for a long time before I did this. So
That's true.
I was, so I
And you
kind
know
of,
what? Because of our technical issues, which by the way I resolved while
okay,
while you were speaking, thank goodness. But that would have been my first question is
right.
what brought your interest into this area of study to begin with?
Yeah, and what was I just going to say? And part of that question, I should say, when I decided to write about beer, I also I I decided early on that it was going to be a sort of public facing book, that I was going to try to write this in a more informal, lighthearted kind of tone. Um, and I wanted to kind of use it both to tell people about beer in Mesopotamia, but to kind of use beer as a way of getting people into the broader culture. And so I think you probably get a sense of that. I
Yeah.
tried to like bring in a lot of the most famous pieces of evidence, like excavations and things that we have. So, for example, I used beer to get us into the Royal Cemetery of Ur, this famous archaeological evidence we have. So, I think I hope that in the book, readers come away with not just an understanding of beer in Mesopotamia, but of this whole culture, which is, it's really fascinating. And I don't know if I'm answering your question or not, but you
No,
made
no,
me think of
you
another.
actually are. And you know,
Mhm.
I did detach you from what you majored in because of the fact that before the interview started, I was telling you that it was an easy read. I really enjoyed it. But that's the beauty of it. You know, there was a lot of storytelling in it and bringing a lot of other characters uh, to show how they used beer. But then you go into other information, which it's really a wonderful way to also, yeah, you're right, bring in the education. It wasn't just like piling on the information, just
That's
about
what I
one
was.
specific topic. But yeah, so I'm just curious now though, and I'm sure maybe our audience is what drew you into majoring in this area,
Oh, right.
and
Earlier, yeah.
yeah, I mean,
Um,
because you're born in North Carolina, correct?
mhm.
Yeah, you were
Yeah,
born in
yeah.
North. So what drew you there? Was it something that you studied or something you saw, or what inspired you to go in that
Yeah.
direction?
I don't know if I remember exactly how it happened. So I certainly was interested from pretty young in, some of these ancient cultures that went. So I learned about Egypt and Mesopotamia when I was pretty young, but not in great depth, and a little bit more like in high school. But I think I really um, embraced it in college. I went to, as I think you mentioned, I went to the University of Edinburgh in Scotland for my undergrad, and I was majoring in archaeology there. But when I first started, I had decided I was going to focus on Celtic archaeology, so kind of Iron Age Europe. And I don't remember exactly how this happened, but I believe that I took a course with Trevor Watkins, who ended up being my advisor there, about ancient Mesopotamia, and it kind of reminded me of why I had been interested in that when I was younger, and um, I think that I was really attracted to studying these really earliest cities, earliest states. I loved that. And I like studying these really enormous settlements where you have this new level of complexity in terms of how people are living together. And I also love the fact that you start getting written evidence very early, so you can be combining archaeological evidence, so material remains, with the written record. So I think that that's how I got into it. So as an undergrad, I wrote a thesis about early writing in Mesopotamia, and then I decided to go on and focus on it more in grad school.
So what is your next work? Do you have something that you plan? Are you working on something currently that relates to that region or
Yeah,
the
sure.
area?
So, I mean, my most immediate thing I'm working on at the moment is I'm editing a volume on wine in the ancient world. So, I've brought together a bunch of different scholars who focus on different regions. So it's about grape wine. So different parts of the ancient world where they were drinking grape wine. And so that's the thing that I need to deal with most immediately. And so that's been a lot of fun because I have brought in people who specialize in Mesopotamia, but also people from across, from Egypt, across the Mediterranean. And so that's a lot of fun. And it's interesting because wine occupied a very different position in Mesopotamia. It was basically available from pretty early on, but it was coming in general as an import from surrounding regions, whereas beer was their sort of beverage of choice.
And I remember in the article when I was interviewing you, you mentioned something that wine ended up replacing beer over time. So, what happened historically to the status of beer over time? And in comparison to what you're saying now, it seems like wine became more of like the daily drink.
Yeah. So, and I'm not sure that I know that I can explain it in any very detailed way, but, and in the article, you kind of take the history a little further forward than what I was able to do. So on the one hand, so grape wine, like I was saying, was a kind of import from pretty early on that then gradually became more and more available. So by the first millennium BC, for example, it was definitely more widely available. But the other thing that happens is, so I said that they had been adding date syrup to beer from earlier on, but we also get clear evidence that they start drinking a date wine, which is basically an alcoholic beverage made just from dates. And so what makes things confusing is that they basically use the same terms that they were using to refer to beer when they refer to this date wine. So they're calling date wine basically beer, which complicates things. I don't think that I've been able to, I haven't made an argument for exactly that there was necessarily a sort of replacement of beer during the periods that I'm talking about, but definitely you get the addition of this other beverage that's being considered similar in some way.
So I want to add that, as I said, there was an article that's out, and it's called "In the Land of Ninkasi." So people can look up the Chaldean news. I'll be posting that later, the link. But it's called "In the Land of Ninkasi: A History of Beer in Ancient Mesopotamia." And as you said, I did add additions to specifically what happened in Iraq over the years and why beer, kind of fell out of favor, kind of. So yeah. And so we have a couple of minutes left, and I was, what are some last words that you wanna share with us? And by the way, some of the things that you're saying, a lot of our younger people are interested in this history more today than they were before, because a lot of our history was just kind of wrapped up in just immigrating and adjusting and assimilating and all these other things that a lot of migrant communities experience. And so the younger generation has been very wonderful in trying to learn about all this areas that you've been studying for a long time. So just any last words for our audience?
Yeah, sure. So I hope they enjoy my book. One thing I was thinking about it was in another question that you asked. Well, we were sort of talking about the similarities to today, and I was thinking, well, yes. So they were both home brewing. Beer was being brewed on many different levels. Partly it was being brewed in taverns. So they had taverns, something like we have today, where you could go and purchase beer from a tavern keeper. And one episode that I really enjoy in the book that I think is a good kind of example of these, you brought this up earlier. I really tried to do a lot of, in order to get us into the evidence and some of the challenges of interpretation, I try to use little semi-fictional kind of vignettes or stories where we sort of take you back into the past and put us in a particular place and time. And one of those is I take us on this. We're basically in the streets following these two guys who are doing something weird. They keep stooping down and picking up dirt and putting it in a little sack from different doorways. And then they're wandering through the city doing that over and over. And we follow them down to the river where they get some river water and they mix it up with all this dirt. And we follow them and we end up at a tavern where they smear some of this mud basically across the doorway. They go up to the roof and they do some kind of ritual. And so then I use that to get into what is So you have both the familiar here of sort of tavern life, but then also kind of the unfamiliar, which is I got all of this. I'm narrating this out of a specific ritual called a Namburbi ritual, where they would, because, for example, omens were a big thing in the Mesopotamian world. The world was full of all these signs that you could read to get messages from the gods. But if you got negative messages, negative omens, there were special rituals that you could use to counteract them. And so we have examples of a special ritual that they were doing to counteract a negative omen about a tavern, about the success of a tavern. So that's what we were watching these two guys doing. Anyways, yeah.
Well, just to show also how it was such a normal thing, and even women, the first recorded queen, Queen Kubaba, Sumerian queen, is from what I read, was a tavern keeper. She was. Is that correct?
You
That
mean from the Sumerian king list?
Yeah,
I
from
think
the
that's right.
Sumerian king list. Yeah, she was the only, and she, she was a bird. I mean, she kept, yeah, and that was just such a strong part of their life. So it's just interesting. The more for myself, and I think others, the more they study about their history, and then they'll find all these things that it is called the cradle of civilization for many reasons, actually, including whether it's writing or the beer or a lot of other cultural things that we still practice today. We just sometimes are not aware how similar these things were even thousands of years ago. So, but you know what? It is a fun book to read. That's an important thing, and it's available on Amazon. It's very easy to purchase. It's also available as an ebook. It's a fun read, and for anybody that's interested not only in the subject of beer but in the topic of Mesopotamia, of history, all these other characters the historical characters also that you bring forth are very important for readers to know. So thank you so much, Tate, and thank you for your patience when we had a couple of minutes of technical difficulties, but it was worked out, thank goodness.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been nice talking to you.
Okay, thank you. And I will post the article later today so people can also read about the same topic. Thank you.
Great,
Thank you,
thanks.
everyone, for watching, and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.